In the dimly lit corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, where shadows danced with the flickering candlelight of a Florentine evening in 1513, Niccolo Machiavelli sat hunched over his wooden desk, his quill scratching against parchment with the urgency of a man racing against time itself. The political theorist who would come to define the very essence of strategic thinking was not merely writing about power, he was dissecting the human soul, examining how the right questions could penetrate the deepest recesses of human emotion and transform weakness into invincible strength. The manuscript before him bore traces of wine stains and sleepless nights, yet within its pages lay insights that would echo through centuries. Machiavelli understood something profound that most of his contemporaries missed entirely. The questions we ask ourselves determine not just what we think, but who we become. More critically, they determine whether we remain vulnerable to external destruction or forge ourselves into something unbreakable. The architecture of emotional vulnerability. The Florentine observed that most men walk through life asking themselves the wrong questions. They inquire about comfort rather than strength, about acceptance rather than authenticity, about avoiding pain rather than embracing transformation. These questions, he noted with characteristic precision, create emotional patterns that leave individuals perpetually at the mercy of circumstances beyond their control. Consider the merchant Antonio, whom Machiavelli encountered in the bustling markets of Florence. Antonio's daily internal dialogue revolved around questions of security. Will my customers approve of this decision? What if my competitors undercut my prices? How can I avoid offending the guild leaders? Each question drew him deeper into a web of dependency, where his emotional state fluctuated wildly based on external validation and circumstance. Machiavelli watched as Antonio's business decisions became increasingly timid, his posture more deferential, his sleep more troubled. The merchant had unknowingly trained his mind to seek emotional equilibrium through external sources, a fundamental error that guaranteed perpetual instability. Every question Antonio asked reinforced his position as a reactor rather than an actor in his own life's drama. The political philosopher recognized this pattern across all levels of society, from the lowest craftsman to the highest noble. The questions that dominated their internal landscape created emotional architectures built on shifting sand. When external circumstances changed, as they inevitably would in the turbulent political climate of Renaissance Italy, these individuals found themselves emotionally devastated, their sense of self crumbling with their external supports. But Machiavelli discovered something far more intriguing. Certain questions possessed the power to create entirely different emotional dynamics. These questions didn't seek comfort or validation. Instead, they probed for truth, demanded growth, and systematically dismantled the very weaknesses that made individuals vulnerable to external manipulation or destruction. The transformation through strategic inquiry. The turning point in Machiavelli's understanding came through his observation of Lorenzo de' Medici the Younger, a man who seemed to possess an almost supernatural resilience in the face of political upheaval. While others in similar positions crumbled under pressure, Lorenzo appeared to grow stronger with each challenge. The secret, Machiavelli discovered, lay not in Lorenzo's circumstances, but in the questions he habitually asked himself. Where others inquired, "How can I maintain my current position?" Lorenzo asked, "What aspects of my current position make me weak?" Where others wondered, "How can I avoid conflict?" Lorenzo questioned, "What conflicts am I avoiding that are making me weaker?" Most tellingly, where others sought to preserve their existing self-concept, Lorenzo systematically interrogated and dismantled any part of his identity that created dependency or vulnerability. This pattern of questioning created what Machiavelli termed auto-destruction of weakness, a deliberate, systematic process by which an individual identifies and eliminates the aspects of their character that make them susceptible to external manipulation or defeat. The process required a level of self-honesty that most found unbearable, but for those who embraced it, the rewards were extraordinary. Lorenzo's questions didn't merely seek information, they created emotional tension that demanded resolution through action. When he asked himself, "What am I afraid to lose?" the question generated discomfort that could only be resolved by either facing the fear or eliminating the attachment that created it. When he inquired, "What story am I telling myself to avoid difficult truths?" the emotional friction forced him to confront self-deception head-on. The emotional pull created by these questions was fundamentally different from the gravitational force of comfort-seeking inquiries. Instead of drawing Lorenzo toward safety and stagnation, his questions pulled him toward growth and strength, even when that path led through temporary discomfort or loss. Each question functioned as a strategic tool, designed not to make him feel better, but to make him more formidable. Machiavelli observed that this process created a peculiar paradox. By systematically destroying his weak self, Lorenzo became essentially indestructible by external forces. His enemies could take his wealth, his position, even his allies, but they could not touch the core of his being because he had already eliminated everything within himself that could be used against him. The practical mechanics of emotional sovereignty. The transformation process that Machiavelli documented was neither mystical nor accidental. It followed specific, observable patterns that could be studied, understood, and replicated. The key lay in understanding how questions create emotional momentum and learning to harness that momentum for strategic self-development rather than allowing it to scatter randomly across the landscape of daily concerns. The first principle Machiavelli identified was the concept of productive discomfort. Most individuals, he noted, unconsciously organized their mental lives to minimize emotional friction. They asked questions designed to maintain their existing comfort zones and validate their current choices. This approach, while temporarily soothing, created long-term vulnerability by preventing the growth that comes from grappling with difficult truths. Strategic questioning, by contrast, deliberately generated productive discomfort. These questions were designed to surface hidden fears, challenge comfortable assumptions, and force confrontation with aspects of the self that might otherwise remain hidden. The discomfort they created served as fuel for transformation, providing the emotional energy necessary to break through existing patterns and limitations. Machiavelli documented how Lorenzo systematically applied this principle across different domains of his life. In politics, instead of asking, "How can I maintain my alliances?" he asked, "Which of my alliances are based on my weaknesses rather than my strengths?" This question created enough emotional tension to motivate a thorough examination of his political relationships, leading him to restructure his entire network based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than dependency and fear. In personal relationships, rather than wondering, "How can I make others like me?" Lorenzo inquired, "What parts of myself am I hiding to gain approval?" The emotional discomfort generated by honest answers to this question drove him to gradually reveal his authentic self, paradoxically making his relationships both fewer and far more meaningful. Those who remained in his circle after this process were genuinely aligned with who he was. The questioning process also extended to his relationship with material possessions and status symbols. Instead of asking, "How can I acquire more?" Lorenzo examined, "What do I own that owns me?" This inquiry led him to systematically eliminate dependencies that could be used to manipulate or control him. He kept what served his purposes and goals while releasing what served merely to maintain his image or provide psychological security. Perhaps most importantly, Machiavelli observed that Lorenzo applied this questioning process to his own emotional patterns and reactive tendencies. Rather than simply accepting anger, fear, or desire as natural and unchangeable, he asked, "What triggers these responses, and how do they make me predictable to my enemies?" This level of self-examination allowed him to identify and modify emotional patterns that could be exploited by others. The cumulative effect of this systematic self-examination was profound. Lorenzo became increasingly difficult to manipulate because he had eliminated the internal triggers that others typically used to influence behavior. He became harder to intimidate because he had already faced and overcome his deepest fears. He became impossible to control through material incentives because he had reduced his dependencies to the absolute minimum necessary for his goals. Most remarkably, Machiavelli noted that this process didn't make Lorenzo cold or unfeeling. Instead, it made his emotions more authentic and therefore more powerful. When he did experience anger, it was genuine and strategic rather than reactive and manipulable. When he showed affection, it carried weight because it wasn't performative or approval-seeking. His emotional responses became tools of strength rather than sources of vulnerability. The practical mechanics of this transformation involved what Machiavelli termed daily auditing, a regular practice of asking strategic questions and honestly examining the answers. This wasn't a single dramatic moment of self-discovery, but rather a consistent, methodical process of identifying and eliminating weaknesses while building on genuine strengths. Lorenzo would begin each day by asking himself what he was avoiding and why. He would examine what he hoped others wouldn't discover about him, and then work to either change those aspects or openly acknowledge them. He would identify what he was afraid to lose and then either strengthen his ability to protect it or reduce his attachment to it. This process created a feedback loop where each day's questioning revealed new areas for development and each area of development made him less vulnerable to external manipulation or control. Over time, the cumulative effect was to create an individual who had systematically eliminated the weak points that others might exploit while building up genuine sources of inner strength. Machiavelli recognized that this approach required a fundamental shift in how one viewed the purpose of emotional experience. Instead of seeing emotions as things to be managed or suppressed, Lorenzo treated them as information sources about his internal state and potential vulnerabilities. Instead of avoiding emotional discomfort, he learned to interpret it as a signal that growth was needed in a particular area. The strategic value of self-destruction. The concept of destroying one's weak self might seem contradictory, or even destructive, but Machiavelli's analysis revealed it to be the highest form of self-preservation. By eliminating internal vulnerabilities before others could exploit them, Lorenzo essentially removed the weapons that could be used against him. This preemptive self-destruction was actually a form of strategic construction, building an invulnerable core by systematically removing everything that wasn't essential and strong. Machiavelli observed that most people approach self-improvement by trying to add positive qualities while leaving their weaknesses intact. They attempt to become braver while still harboring secret fears, more confident while still depending on external validation, more successful while still being driven by unconscious insecurities. This additive approach, he noted, created internal contradictions that could be exploited by skilled manipulators. Lorenzo's approach was fundamentally different. Rather than trying to build strength on top of weakness, he eliminated the weakness entirely, even when doing so required temporary loss or discomfort. When he discovered that his need for a particular person's approval was making him predictable and manipulable, he didn't try to become more confident while maintaining the relationship. Instead, he systematically eliminated the need for that approval, even if it meant losing the relationship entirely. This process required what Machiavelli termed strategic ruthlessness toward the self. Lorenzo learned to view his own weaknesses with the same dispassionate analysis he would apply to an enemy's vulnerabilities. He didn't excuse them, rationalize them, or try to work around them. He identified them clearly and then took whatever action was necessary to eliminate them, regardless of the short-term emotional cost. The questioning process that drove this elimination was designed to surface these vulnerabilities with surgical precision. When Lorenzo asked himself, "What would I be afraid for my enemies to know about me?" the answers revealed exactly which aspects of his personality and situation needed attention. When he inquired, "What would have to happen for me to feel completely devastated?" the responses mapped out his emotional dependencies with startling clarity. Perhaps most powerfully, when he asked, "What version of myself am I protecting that needs to die?" Lorenzo could identify the false aspects of his identity that were actually sources of weakness rather than strength. These might include his image as someone who never makes mistakes, his role as someone everyone likes, or his identity as someone who always has everything under control. Each of these personas, while potentially flattering, created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by others. The process of destroying these weak aspects of the self created what Machiavelli called emotional sovereignty, a state where one's inner experience is no longer dependent on external circumstances or other people's actions. This didn't mean becoming isolated or unfeeling, but rather ensuring that one's core stability came from internal sources that couldn't be manipulated or removed by others. Machiavelli noted that this transformation often appeared paradoxical to outside observers. As Lorenzo eliminated his dependencies and false personas, he sometimes seemed to become less socially adept or politically smooth. However, what he lost in conventional charm, he gained in authentic power. People began to trust him more because they could sense his genuineness. They found him more compelling because he wasn't trying to manage their impression of him. Most importantly, his enemies found him increasingly difficult to predict or control. The strategic questioning that drove this process was relentless but not self-punishing. Lorenzo learned to ask hard questions not to torture himself, but to gather the intelligence necessary for strategic self-development. Each question was a tool designed to reveal information that could be used to eliminate vulnerability and build genuine strength. Over time, this process created what Machiavelli described as compound invulnerability. Each weakness that was eliminated made Lorenzo slightly less susceptible to external manipulation. As these small improvements accumulated, they created an exponential effect where he became dramatically more resistant to the forms of influence and control that devastated others in similar positions. The beauty of this approach, Machiavelli observed, was that it didn't require Lorenzo to become a hermit or avoid engagement with the world. Instead, it allowed him to engage more fully and authentically because he wasn't constantly managing his image or protecting his weaknesses. He could focus his energy on pursuing his genuine goals rather than maintaining his defenses against potential attacks on his vulnerabilities. This shift in energy allocation was perhaps the most practical benefit of the self-destruction process. Instead of using mental and emotional resources to prop up weak aspects of his identity, Lorenzo could direct all his energy toward building on his genuine strengths and pursuing his authentic objectives. The cumulative effect was to make him not just more resilient, but also more effective and powerful in practical terms. The emotional physics of question design. Machiavelli's most sophisticated insight concerned what he privately called the emotional physics of questions, the way certain inquiries create psychological momentum that naturally leads toward growth and strength, while others generate forces that pull individuals toward weakness and dependency. Understanding these dynamics allowed Lorenzo to design questions that would reliably produce the emotional energy necessary for continued self-development. The key discovery was that questions functioned like emotional levers, creating internal tension that demands resolution through action. However, not all tension is created equal. Some questions generate what Machiavelli termed productive tension, discomfort that can only be resolved through growth, truth-telling, or the elimination of weakness. Other questions create consumptive tension, anxiety that seeks resolution through comfort, avoidance, or the reinforcement of existing patterns. When Lorenzo asked, "What am I pretending not to know about this situation?" it created productive tension that could only be resolved by acknowledging difficult truths and taking appropriate action. The emotional discomfort generated by this question naturally pulled him toward greater honesty and more effective decision-making. The tension couldn't be relieved through distraction or rationalization, only through confronting reality more directly. In contrast, when others asked themselves questions like, "Why don't people appreciate my efforts?" they created consumptive tension that sought resolution through external validation or internal victim narratives. This type of tension actually pulled individuals away from personal power by encouraging them to focus on factors outside their control rather than on their own choices and development. Machiavelli observed that the most powerful questions shared certain structural characteristics. They assumed personal agency rather than victimhood, focused on internal rather than external factors, and demanded specific rather than vague responses. Most importantly, they were designed to surface information that would be useful for strategic action rather than emotional comfort. The question, "What skills would I need to develop to make this problem irrelevant?" exemplified these characteristics. It assumed that the questioner had the power to grow and change, focused on their own development rather than external circumstances, and demanded specific identification of actionable areas for improvement. The emotional pull created by this question naturally drew Lorenzo toward empowerment and growth. Lorenzo learned to recognize the emotional signature of different types of questions. Productive questions created what he described as uncomfortable clarity, a feeling of discomfort combined with a sense of clear direction for action. Consumptive questions, by contrast, generated comfortable confusion, anxiety that felt familiar, and actually provided an excuse for inaction. The art lay in designing questions that created exactly the right amount of productive tension. Too little, and the question wouldn't generate sufficient motivation for change. Too much, and the resulting overwhelm might lead to avoidance or paralysis. Lorenzo developed a sophisticated sense for calibrating his questions to create optimal emotional leverage for growth. One of his most effective techniques was what Machiavelli called progressive questioning, starting with manageable inquiries and gradually increasing the level of challenge as his capacity for self-honesty developed. He might begin by asking, "What small thing am I avoiding today?" and gradually work up to, "What fundamental aspect of my identity is built on self-deception?" This progressive approach allowed Lorenzo to build what Machiavelli termed truth tolerance, the emotional capacity to handle increasingly direct and challenging self-examination without becoming overwhelmed or defensive. Like building physical strength through graduated resistance training, Lorenzo developed psychological resilience by gradually increasing the intensity of his self-inquiry. The timing of questions also proved crucial. Lorenzo learned to ask different types of questions depending on his emotional state and energy levels. When he felt strong and clear, he could handle the most challenging inquiries about his deepest fears and self-deceptions. When he felt depleted or uncertain, he focused on simpler questions about immediate actions and concrete improvements. Machiavelli noted that Lorenzo also developed the ability to ask meta-questions, inquiries about his questioning process itself. He would examine which questions he was avoiding and why, what patterns existed in his inquiry habits, and how his questioning style evolved over time. This second-order self-awareness allowed him to continuously refine his approach and ensure that he wasn't unknowingly using questions to avoid growth rather than promote it. Perhaps most importantly, Lorenzo learned to distinguish between questions that served his ego and questions that served his development. Ego-serving questions, while sometimes disguised as self-improvement inquiries, were actually designed to reinforce existing self-concepts or justify current choices. Development-serving questions were willing to challenge any aspect of his identity if doing so would lead to greater strength and effectiveness. The emotional physics of his questioning created what Machiavelli described as a growth spiral. Each honest answer revealed new areas for development, which generated new questions, which led to further growth. This self-reinforcing cycle meant that Lorenzo's capacity for self-examination and improvement continuously expanded over time. This systematic approach to question design transformed Lorenzo's entire relationship with uncertainty and difficulty. Instead of seeing challenges as threats to be avoided, he learned to view them as information sources about areas where he might be weak or dependent. His questions helped him extract strategic value from every experience, whether positive or negative. The cumulative effect was to create what Machiavelli called anti-fragile character, a personality structure that actually grew stronger under stress and adversity because it had been systematically designed to transform challenges into opportunities for further development. Lorenzo became not just resilient but actively strengthened by the very forces that would have destroyed someone with a more conventional approach to self-development. The paradox of invulnerability through vulnerability. The most counterintuitive aspect of Machiavelli's observations was how Lorenzo achieved invulnerability through the deliberate embrace of vulnerability. By systematically exposing and examining his weaknesses rather than hiding them, Lorenzo eliminated the very mechanisms through which others typically gain power over individuals. This process required a fundamental redefinition of strength that contradicted most conventional wisdom about power and self-protection. Traditional approaches to invulnerability focus on building defenses, creating armor against potential attacks, accumulating resources to weather storms, or developing the ability to retaliate against threats. Lorenzo's approach was radically different. Instead of building stronger defenses around his weaknesses, he eliminated the weaknesses entirely by bringing them into the light of conscious examination and strategic action. When Lorenzo asked himself, "What am I most ashamed of?" he wasn't engaging in self-flagellation or seeking to feel worse about himself. Instead, he was identifying the aspects of his experience that others could potentially use to manipulate him through shame or blackmail. By bringing these issues into conscious awareness and either resolving them or accepting them completely, he removed their power to influence his behavior. This process required what Machiavelli termed radical honesty with the self, a willingness to see and acknowledge aspects of his personality and history that he would prefer to ignore. However, this honesty served a strategic purpose rather than a masochistic one. Each truth that Lorenzo acknowledged and accepted became immune to being used against him by others. The questioning process that drove this radical honesty was carefully calibrated to be productive rather than destructive. Lorenzo asked, "What am I afraid for others to discover about me?" Not to torture himself with shame, but to identify areas where his fear of exposure was creating behavioral restrictions or manipulation vulnerabilities. Once identified, he could either change what he didn't like about himself or learn to accept it so completely that others' knowledge of it couldn't affect his choices. Machiavelli observed that this approach created a peculiar form of psychological freedom. Because Lorenzo had systematically examined and accepted his own shadows, he was no longer controlled by the fear of their exposure. This freedom allowed him to act based on his genuine assessment of situations, rather than on concerns about how his actions might reveal unflattering aspects of his character. The paradox deepened when Lorenzo began applying this principle to his relationships and social interactions. Instead of carefully managing others' impressions of him, he began selectively revealing aspects of himself that were typically hidden. This strategic vulnerability served multiple purposes. It deepened his genuine connections with others. It removed ammunition that could be used against him, and it attracted people who were aligned with his authentic self rather than his performed persona. When Lorenzo asked, "What would happen if I stopped pretending to be better than I am?" The answer revealed how much energy he was spending on maintaining false impressions. By gradually relaxing these pretenses in strategic ways, he not only freed up enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy, but also discovered which relationships were based on genuine compatibility versus superficial impressions. This process of strategic vulnerability required sophisticated judgment about timing, audience, and degree of revelation. Lorenzo learned to distinguish between vulnerability that served his development and relationships versus vulnerability that simply created new forms of dependency or manipulation risk. The key was maintaining agency in the process, choosing what to reveal, to whom, and under what circumstances. Machiavelli noted that Lorenzo's willingness to acknowledge his limitations paradoxically made others perceive him as more competent rather than less. When he admitted uncertainty about areas outside his expertise, people trusted his confidence in areas where he did claim knowledge. When he acknowledged past mistakes, his current judgment seemed more reliable rather than less so. The transformation was most evident in how Lorenzo handled criticism and attack. Because he had already examined and accepted his genuine flaws, external criticism either told him something he already knew and had decided to accept or change, or revealed the critic's misunderstanding rather than an actual vulnerability. Either way, criticism lost its power to destabilize his emotional equilibrium or force reactive behavior. When enemies attempted to use his past mistakes or character flaws against him, they often found that Lorenzo had already processed these issues more thoroughly than they had. His response might be something like, "Yes, I made that mistake, learned from it, and changed my approach accordingly. What specific concern does that raise about my current proposal?" This response disarmed the attack while redirecting attention to substantive issues. The strategic value of this approach became most apparent during periods of intense political pressure. While others in similar positions became increasingly defensive and reactive under attack, Lorenzo remained stable and effective because he wasn't using energy to protect secrets or maintain false impressions. His authentic self-presentation made him predictable in positive ways while remaining strategically unpredictable because he wasn't controlled by the usual psychological leverage points. Perhaps most remarkably, Lorenzo's embrace of vulnerability in service of invulnerability created what Machiavelli described as gravitational authenticity. People were naturally drawn to his genuine presence because it was so rare in their experience. His willingness to be real in a world of performed personas made him magnetically attractive to others who were seeking authentic connection and strategic partnership. This gravitational quality served practical purposes in Lorenzo's political and business dealings. People wanted to work with him not just because of his competence, but because interacting with him was emotionally refreshing. They didn't have to navigate complex social performances or wonder what he was really thinking. This clarity made negotiations more efficient and partnerships more stable. The cumulative effect of Lorenzo's strategic vulnerability was to create what Machiavelli called transparency power, influence that came from authenticity rather than manipulation. Because people knew where they stood with Lorenzo and trusted that he would be direct about his intentions and limitations, they were more willing to follow his leadership and support his initiatives. The systematic elimination of emotional dependencies. The culmination of Machiavelli's analysis focused on Lorenzo's systematic approach to identifying and eliminating emotional dependencies, those subtle psychological needs that made him controllable by others or vulnerable to circumstances beyond his control. This process represented the most sophisticated application of strategic questioning, requiring Lorenzo to examine not just his obvious attachments but the hidden assumptions and needs that shaped his emotional landscape. Lorenzo discovered that most emotional dependencies operated below the level of conscious awareness. They appeared as automatic preferences, justified responses, or natural reactions rather than choices that could be examined and modified. The questioning process that Machiavelli documented was designed to surface these hidden dependencies and subject them to strategic analysis. One of Lorenzo's most powerful questions was, "What do I need to believe about myself to feel okay?" This inquiry revealed the fundamental self-concepts that his emotional stability depended upon. He discovered, for instance, that he needed to see himself as someone who never acted from petty motivations. This self-concept created a dependency because maintaining it required constant self-monitoring and occasional self-deception when his motivations weren't entirely noble. Rather than simply accepting this need, Lorenzo applied strategic questioning to examine its costs and benefits. He asked himself, what opportunities am I missing because I refuse to acknowledge petty motivations? And how does my need to see myself as above such feelings make me predictable to others? The answers revealed that his self-concept, while flattering, was actually limiting his strategic options and creating vulnerabilities that others could exploit. The elimination process wasn't about becoming petty or embracing negative motivations. Instead, Lorenzo learned to accept that he, like all humans, sometimes acted from less than noble impulses. This acceptance removed the energy he had been spending on maintaining the fiction of constant noble motivation, while also eliminating a potential leverage point that others could use to manipulate him through appeals to his self-image. Lorenzo applied similar analysis to his need for others' respect, his attachment to particular outcomes, his desire for predictability and control, and countless other subtle psychological dependencies. Each examination revealed ways that these needs shaped his behavior in potentially limiting or manipulable ways. The question, "What am I afraid would happen if I stopped needing this?" proved particularly illuminating. Lorenzo discovered that many of his emotional dependencies were based on outdated assumptions about what he required for survival or success. The need for universal approval, for instance, was based on early experiences that were no longer relevant to his adult circumstances and capabilities. Machiavelli observed that Lorenzo's approach to dependency elimination was gradual and experimental rather than sudden and absolute. He would identify a particular emotional need, examine its strategic costs and benefits, and then conduct small experiments in reducing his attachment to it. These experiments provided feedback about which dependencies were truly useful versus those that were simply habitual. For example, when examining his attachment to others' approval, Lorenzo began by deliberately taking small actions that he knew would meet with mild disapproval from certain people. He observed his emotional response to their reactions and practiced maintaining his equilibrium regardless of their opinions. Gradually, he expanded these experiments until he could act based on his own judgment even when facing significant social pressure. The process of dependency elimination created what Machiavelli termed emotional mobility, the ability to move fluidly between different psychological states without being trapped by any particular need or attachment. Lorenzo could enjoy others' approval when it was present without being devastated by its absence. He could work toward preferred outcomes without being paralyzed when circumstances didn't unfold as expected. This emotional mobility translated directly into strategic advantage in his political and personal dealings. Because Lorenzo wasn't controlled by predictable needs, others found it difficult to manipulate him through the usual methods of offering rewards or threatening punishments. His responses were based on strategic calculation rather than emotional compulsion, making him both more effective and less predictable. Perhaps most importantly, the elimination of emotional dependencies freed Lorenzo to pursue his authentic goals rather than the goals that his dependencies dictated. When he no longer needed universal approval, he could focus on earning the respect of people whose opinions actually mattered for his objectives. When he released his attachment to controlling outcomes, he could invest his energy more efficiently in the factors that were actually within his influence. Machiavelli noted that this process didn't make Lorenzo emotionally flat or disconnected. Instead, it made his emotional responses more genuine because they weren't contaminated by hidden dependencies or unconscious compulsions. When he felt anger, it was clean anger, about genuine injustices rather than reactive anger about threatened ego needs. When he experienced joy, it was authentic appreciation rather than relief about maintained dependencies. The systematic nature of Lorenzo's approach meant that he continuously discovered new levels of subtle dependency that could be examined and potentially eliminated. This ongoing process kept him growing in emotional freedom and strategic flexibility throughout his life. Each year, he became slightly less controllable and more authentically powerful. The cumulative effect of this dependency elimination was to create what Machiavelli called sovereign consciousness, a state of awareness that was self-directed rather than other-directed, internally referenced rather than externally validated, and strategically flexible rather than emotionally compulsive. Lorenzo had become, in the deepest sense, his own man. The final transformation. From self-destruction to reconstruction, in the final phase of Lorenzo's transformation, Machiavelli observed something unexpected. Having systematically destroyed his weak self, Lorenzo began a process of conscious self-construction that was fundamentally different from his original personality development. This reconstruction phase was characterized by deliberate choice rather than unconscious reaction, strategic design rather than random accumulation of habits and traits. The questioning process that guided this reconstruction was perhaps the most sophisticated of all. Instead of asking what to eliminate or overcome, Lorenzo began asking, "What kind of person do I choose to become?" and "What qualities would serve my authentic purposes?" These questions assumed complete freedom to redesign himself while maintaining the hard-won wisdom about which traits created strength versus vulnerability. Lorenzo discovered that, having eliminated his emotional dependencies and false self-concepts, he had created what Machiavelli termed psychological blank slate, a foundation of authentic self-knowledge and emotional stability upon which he could consciously build whatever characteristics would best serve his chosen purposes. This wasn't about becoming someone else, but rather about becoming the most strategic and effective version of his essential self. The reconstruction process was guided by questions like, what virtues would make me more effective while remaining authentic? And how can I develop the qualities I genuinely admire without creating new dependencies? Lorenzo learned to distinguish between traits that represented genuine development versus those that were simply new forms of ego protection or social performance. One of his most significant discoveries was that many qualities traditionally viewed as virtues could actually create vulnerabilities if not properly calibrated. Loyalty, for instance, was valuable when based on mutual respect and shared values, but became a weakness when it prevented necessary strategic adjustments or allowed others to take advantage of predictable behavior. Lorenzo learned to ask, how can I embody this quality in a way that serves my purposes without making me manipulable? This question helped him develop what Machiavelli called strategic virtues, positive qualities that enhanced his effectiveness and authenticity while maintaining his hard-won emotional sovereignty. The reconstruction process also involved deliberately developing capabilities that would serve his chosen life direction. Having eliminated the energy drains created by emotional dependencies and false personas, Lorenzo found himself with significantly more mental and emotional resources to invest in meaningful growth. He could focus on building genuine skills and qualities rather than maintaining psychological defenses. Machiavelli observed that Lorenzo's self-construction was remarkable for its integration of apparent opposites. He developed the ability to be both compassionate and ruthless, both open and strategically private, both confident and genuinely humble. These weren't contradictions, but rather sophisticated responses to different situations and purposes. The questioning that enabled this integration focused on context and purpose rather than absolute rules. Instead of asking, should I be compassionate? Lorenzo asked, when does compassion serve my authentic purposes and relationships? And when does it become a form of weakness that others can exploit? This contextual approach allowed him to be genuinely good-hearted while maintaining strategic effectiveness. Perhaps most remarkably, Lorenzo's reconstruction phase was characterized by what Machiavelli called conscious character development, the deliberate cultivation of traits and capabilities based on their strategic value and authentic alignment rather than on social expectations or unconscious conditioning. This represented a fundamentally different approach to personal development than most people ever achieved. The final result of Lorenzo's transformation was what Machiavelli described as integrated invulnerability, a personality structure that was simultaneously authentic, effective, and resistant to external manipulation or control. Lorenzo had become someone who could engage fully with life while remaining fundamentally unshakable, because his core identity was consciously constructed rather than accidentally accumulated. This integrated state allowed Lorenzo to be genuinely caring without being codependent, truly strong without being rigid, and authentically confident without being arrogant. He had achieved what Machiavelli considered the highest form of human development, the conscious creation of a self that was both true to its essential nature and optimally adapted to achieve its chosen purposes. The transformation was complete, yet ongoing. Lorenzo had established a foundation of self-knowledge and emotional sovereignty that would continue supporting further growth throughout his life. He had become, in Machiavelli's words, a man who could never be destroyed by others because he had already destroyed everything within himself that could be used against him, and consciously created everything that would serve his authentic purposes. As Machiavelli concluded his observations in that candlelit study, he recognized that he had documented something far more significant than political strategy or personal development techniques. He had witnessed the conscious evolution of human character from unconscious reactivity to strategic authenticity, a transformation made possible by the systematic application of the right questions to create emotional pull toward growth, strength, and ultimate invulnerability. The manuscript before him contained insights that would challenge readers for centuries to come. That true strength comes not from building defenses but from eliminating vulnerabilities, that invulnerability is achieved through strategic vulnerability, and that the highest form of power comes from the systematic destruction of one's weak self in service of consciously constructing one's strong self. The right questions, Machiavelli had discovered, were indeed the keys to this ultimate transformation. The creation of a human being who could never be destroyed by others because they had learned to destroy their own weaknesses first.